Andrew and Tristan Tate were arrested in Miami after British authorities added rape and sex trafficking charges, according to PBS, NPR, The Washington Post, and The Guardian. The reports place the brothers in Florida custody while the new allegations are separated from earlier Romanian proceedings and move toward the next legal checkpoint. The important fact is not internet reaction around the Tates. It is that named prosecutors and courts now have to state what charges, extradition steps, or hearing dates come next. PBS and NPR frame the case as a law enforcement action, while The Washington Post and Guardian add the wider timeline of allegations and prior controversy. The public consequence is whether the Miami arrest opens a concrete court path in the United States or simply holds the brothers for another jurisdiction. Watch for a docket entry, prosecutor statement, or court order that confirms where the case goes next, because that document will matter more than speculation online. The immediate public record to watch is the first document that states custody status, hearing timing, and which jurisdiction is responsible for the next step. Until that filing appears, separate the confirmed arrest, the British allegations, and any later extradition move as three distinct legal facts. That separation keeps the story anchored to records rather than reputation, and it gives viewers a clear next legal checkpoint. Taylor Farms expanded an iceberg lettuce recall to 27 states after possible cyclospora contamination, with CNBC, The New York Times, CNN, and The Guardian all tracking the food safety warning. The recall matters because bagged lettuce moves quickly through retailers, restaurants, and home refrigerators, so a quiet product notice can become a broad public health problem if shoppers miss it. CNN and The Times emphasize the contamination risk, while CNBC and The Guardian focus on the expanding footprint and the products consumers need to check. Cyclospore infections can take days to show symptoms, which means case counts and exposure windows may keep changing after the initial recall. For households, the immediate step is matching package labels and store purchases against the company and regulator notices, not relying on memory alone. Watch for updated Food and Drug Administration or company guidance listing more lots, stores, or linked illnesses, because that is the signal that the risk is either contained or widening. The safest consumer advice will come from the recall notice itself, because brand names, package dates, and distribution lists are more reliable than social posts. A later CDC or FDA update would turn this from a product warning into a clearer outbreak timeline. Until then, shoppers should treat the recall list, not a general lettuce warning, as the operational fact. A flash flood near Utah's Sunglow campground left 5 family members dead, according to Moab Sun News, The New York Times, The Guardian, and The New York Post. The early reports describe storms sweeping through a canyon area where water can rise faster than campers or rescue crews can react. This story is less about one isolated weather headline than about the gap between a forecast, a warning, and what people on the ground can actually do in rugged terrain. Local coverage gives the location and response timeline, while national outlets show why the deaths are drawing wider attention to canyon flooding risk. The next practical consequence is whether county officials, park managers, or emergency agencies revise warning procedures, campground closures, or rescue protocols before the next storm cycle. Watch for a sheriff's update, victims' identification, or emergency management review that explains how the flood unfolded and what public safety changes may follow. The official timeline should also show whether warnings reached campers before the canyon filled, and whether campground closures, siren alerts, or phone warnings should change before families return to similar canyon sites. Those details decide whether the response becomes a local tragedy report or a broader safety review. That finding would matter for campground policy, rescue preparation, and public warnings across similar Utah Canyon areas. President Trump says the new Air Force One aircraft connected to Qatar will be taken out of service so it can be upgraded and, in his words, maxed out. Reuters, The New York Times, Bloomberg, and the Times of Israel all treat the comments as a procurement and security story, not just a remark about a plane. The key issue is what modifications are actually required before a head-of-state aircraft can carry the communications, defense, and reliability systems expected for presidential travel. Reuters and Bloomberg point to added capabilities, while the Times places the comment inside the broader debate over the Qatari jet and its security concerns. The consequence is budgetary and operational. Delays, retrofits, and certification can affect both cost and public trust in the handoff. Watch for an Air Force, White House, or procurement update that names the upgrade scope and schedule, because that will show whether the plan is routine modification or a larger reset. The next procurement record should separate ordinary interior work from security communications, defensive systems, and any certification delays that affect presidential travel. If costs or delivery dates change, that record becomes the real accountability point. It also tells taxpayers whether the retrofit is planned security work or a more expensive late redesign for presidential travel safety planning. Cuban artist and dissident Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara has arrived in the United States after 5 years in prison and exile from Cuba, according to AP, NPR, and Telegraph World. His case matters because it links one person's release to a broader fight over artistic freedom, political imprisonment, and pressure on Havana over human rights cases. AP and NPR describe a dissident artist whose detention became a symbol for activists outside Cuba as well as for families still waiting on other prisoners. Telegraph World keeps the local arrival and exile angle in the source mix, showing that the story is both personal and diplomatic. The immediate development is his arrival and public status in the United States, but the larger question is whether Cuba changes anything for other jailed artists, protesters, or opposition figures. AP and NPR provide the reliable baseline, while follow-up reporting should clarify his legal status and advocacy plans. Watch for statements from Otero Alcantara, rights groups, or U.S. officials that say whether this exile is an isolated release or part of a broader diplomatic pattern. His arrival also gives reporters a chance to ask which conditions were attached to his departure and whether Cuban authorities plan similar releases for others. That answer matters for exiled artists who may now look to his case as a precedent. U.S. strikes on Iran have entered a ninth night as reports of American troop deaths raise fears that the conflict could widen across the region. Reuters and CNN describe renewed U.S. action after an Iranian attack, while Defense Security Asia and SABC News track the regional military and political reaction. The central question is whether Washington and Tehran keep the exchange inside a limited retaliatory cycle or cross into a broader war involving bases, shipping lanes, and allied governments. CNN's live updates show the pace of new information, while Reuters is the source to watch for confirmed official statements on casualties, targets, and diplomatic contact. Congress also becomes part of the story if lawmakers demand legal justification or limits on further strikes. Watch for a Pentagon briefing, Iranian response, or allied government statement that sets the next boundary, because one confirmed order can change the risk level for the whole region. The most important details are who authorized each strike, whether American forces are moving defensively, whether regional partners are being asked to join, and whether embassies or air defenses shift posture. If those details point in different directions, escalation risk becomes harder to price or contain. That evidence will decide whether this remains retaliation or becomes a wider regional military campaign this week ahead regionally. Russia launched one of its largest ballistic missile attacks on Kyiv since the war began, according to Al Jazeera, CNBC, CNN, and France 24. The strike wave matters because ballistic missiles compress warning time and test both Ukrainian air defenses and civilian emergency systems in the capital. CNBC adds NATO warnings about Moscow's broader posture, while CNN and Al Jazeera focus on the scale of the Kyiv attack itself. France 24 keeps the European security frame in view, because allied capitals will read the attack alongside ammunition, air defense, and sanctions decisions. For residents, the consequence is immediate: shelter alerts, damage assessments, power disruptions, and the search for casualties after each impact. For governments, the next decision is whether Ukraine receives additional air defense support or whether NATO leaders treat the attack as another signal of escalation pressure. Watch for Kyiv casualty figures, intercepted missile totals, and new allied pledges, because those details will show whether this was a single surge or part of a larger Russian campaign. If the attack damages energy systems or shelters, the humanitarian impact will become part of the defense debate, especially if Ukraine must choose between protecting the capital, the grid, and frontline positions. Those choices will shape civilian protection in Kyiv and the next round of requests to Western allies now. New York mayoral candidate Zoran Mamdani says the city is exploring whether it could arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if the Israeli prime minister visits New York, with The Guardian, The New York Times, Fox News, and The New York Post all covering the remarks. The story turns on the collision between local politics, international law, diplomatic immunity, and the arrest warrant debate around Netanyahu. Mamdani's phrase that Netanyahu is a war criminal drew the headline, but the practical question is whether any city official would have legal authority to act during a United Nations visit. The Times frames the claim as a legal and political test, while Fox and the Post highlight the domestic backlash. The consequence is less about one quote than about how campaign promises meet federal foreign policy limits and diplomatic protections. Watch for a city legal memo, State Department response, or campaign clarification that shows whether this is a symbolic position or a policy plan. The legal answer matters because New York hosts world leaders under federal and international rules that a city campaign cannot simply rewrite on its own. A formal response would show whether the claim survives contact with actual jurisdiction and immunity rules. That is the difference between campaign rhetoric, a city law question, and a federal diplomatic dispute today legally.